Python and Oracle Database Office Hours June 2020. We haven't had one for a few months for various reasons. Actually, originally had some vacations scheduled, and so we were putting things off. And then we wanted to wait a little closer till we had some more stuff to talk about. So now we are here. And we're going to talk about what's coming in CX Oracle 8.0. So currently you have 7.3 out there as the latest version, and we're working hard on this new version. Standard safe harbor statements, especially in open source land, everything is subject to change. So anything I might say about futures could be different. But who are we? I am in the middle. I'm Christopher Jones, product manager for some of the scripting languages and data access layer tools in Oracle Database Group. So I get to do all of the sort of documentation things, legal things, talking to you, obviously, some of the fun and not so fun things there, but it keeps me interested, which is good. Anthony Tuininga is online. He's the creator and main, almost sole maintainer of the CX Oracle module, the fantastic module that you use to access Oracle database from Python. It does a lot of work also with our other data access layers and APIs like the Node.js layer. Started working with some of one of the Go drivers for the Go language, and a lot of the other internal stuff which is coming downstream and upstream to you somewhere in the future. And we also have Blaine Carter, who's our evangelist, goes out there, does a lot of conferences, user groups, runs hands-on lab, etc., etc., etc. So for those who haven't joined Office Hours before, we have this sort of quick icebreaker theme. Then we really just throw it open to you to type and chat and ask questions. So if you want to prepare with some questions beforehand, that would be good. So when we get to the end, there's no dead silence. And then we wrap up. Generally, it's pretty quick. There's a recording available on the Office Hours page, so you can come back to it if you want, or send your best friends and relations to view it afterwards. So the stuff. So CX Oracle 8. I have a couple of slides, a couple of demos. There's nothing much to this morning. Sunday morning, you can probably see it's kind of dark here. That's because the windows in front of me are black because it's 6 o'clock in the morning here in Melbourne, Australia. But anyway, we're going to talk about what is happening in your land at the moment, which is CX Oracle 8. So this is a work in progress. It's out there on GitHub. So the GitHub source code can be built. So just follow the install instructions. Clone the source code, do a compile, install. You can set it up with a couple of steps pretty quickly and test it out for us. And we recommend you do this. And this is because we're kind of at the end stage of development. Want to wrap it up pretty quickly. Otherwise, it'll just drag on, and you never get any of these great features out there. Top features, so Python 3. So Python people are aware that the upstream, the main Python developers, core developers, have ceased work on Python 2. So that's kind of dead, nothing happening there. We're taking this opportunity now with CX Oracle 8 to say Python 3 support is all that it will support. So it actually won't work with Python 2. You can continue to use CX Oracle 7 with Python 2, don't worry about that. But for all these new features, you need to be using Python 3. We've looked at the download numbers. You can go and run those from the Python PyPy repository, and you see that almost everybody downloading new packages of CX Oracle are already using Python 3. So this isn't going to be a big deal for most of you. UTF-8, got a slide on that, so I'll talk about that in a minute. Demos on the next two. I've got a couple of demos on the next two, this new method Init Oracle client and the new tuning macro Prefetch rows. And DB type constants Anthony tells me it's not a big change. It's really just a sort of standardization cleanup. But there's a big entry in the changelog if you want to go and look at that. And really, he's just added some new names and new aliases to try and clean up the namespace there. Anything else, Anthony, that to be said about the DB type constants before I move on to the interesting bits?
I don't think so. There's just a few little niggledies, which is why there's so much entries in there, but there's not really that much to it. Most people won't even notice.
Okay, so let's not talk about that. You can look at the changelog with that. Okay, so globalization. So we have always seen people in the recent times get tricked by not setting the proper encodings when they're running their Python apps. And so we're now taking this opportunity to change the defaults, which you use for something stupid like US7 ASCII or ASCII to UTF-8. So we're not expecting many of you to see changes because you're probably already setting something like UTF-8 anyway. And if you're using the encoding, N encoding, when you're using connect or creating a session pool, those will continue to work. And remember, of course, just a side note, as you might have found and you can read in the documentation, these are Python encoding names, not the Oracle names. But one big change in this, and debates backwards and forwards about how this is best implemented and the pros and cons, is that if you're setting the character set by NLS lang, that's no longer going to work. Now you're lucky, of course, because the default will be UTF-8 because your NLS lang will be ignored, so you probably won't notice a difference. But if you are doing something special, then maybe you want to go and change and use these encoding and NN encoding. The N encoding is the national language for things like the nchar types, nvarchar, nclob encoding. This is just their standard varchar encoding. So just be aware of that one small change. And this, and then the next thing that we have, I'll show you kind of why we're calling this CX Oracle 8. I mean, this is a fairly major change. So much of CX Oracle has been there for a long time. It's just going to continue to work for you. But this is going to be a better out-of-the-box experience for 99% of people out there. Okay, I have a demo of this. So we have a new method, as you can see here in the middle, Init Oracle Client. I'll talk through some of these later. One big thing is that this libdir, as you can kind of guess, I'm passing a path to my Oracle client libraries, and you all know with CX Oracle, I need some Oracle client libraries to be able to actually talk to the database. On Linux, you're still going to need to set the external system search path before you start your Python application. Windows and Mac OS, you don't need to set anything now. You can just use this function, basically unzip instant client, set this function. You don't need to set path, LD library path, or DYLD path. You don't on Mac. It's getting a little more complex as Apple kind of locked down and need things notarized, and it gets very messy. This is really kind of very convenient on Mac at the moment. Looking forward to getting this out to stop a few of the questions which are coming up with, particularly like this new Mac OS Catalina, like the current version. Config dir, as you've already heard, TNS name, SQL.org access file. So you don't need to set, as some of you may remember, the TNS_admin environment variable. So basically you can initialize things within the application, except with this little glitch here on Linux. And that's something to do with the way that the Oracle client libraries are built. And yes, we're trying to work with the various teams internally to get that changed. Turns out to be a very interesting problem, all to do with patching and security libraries and third-party licenses and yada, yada, yada. But that's the joys of my life, working through those things. Let's just have a quick demo of that. Where's my code got to? And it's the same terminal. That's a bit annoying. So this is pretty much as you saw before. I'm actually at the bottom doing a query, and I'm selecting the client driver name. I'm going to show you some of these other attributes I didn't talk about with this particular query. I have my environment variable set up in my credential set up as environment variables. So that's going to work nicely. So this is my Mac path. Uses C. Jones instant client. So I do actually have instant client set there. Let me just split the screen for you. And on the right-hand side, I'm going to run this file, running Python 3, of course, and everything works fine. So let me not worry about the output for the minute. I'll come back and explain that. But if I set this to something which doesn't exist and then run it, I get my standard error, DPI 1047, which some of you have probably cursed at Oracle about in the past. You can see it's actually given the path here. The other little trick, or not trick, little nicety is that this URL in the error message is the URL that I passed here as this error URL. So if you're writing your own custom applications and you want to distribute it and you don't think that your users actually care that they're using CX Oracle and the Oracle stack underneath, you can put your own custom error messages in here for installation help. And so you can then capture those clicks and actually give them something constructive in terms of how you've configured your distribution. Going back to the driver name at the bottom, you can see also this is useful if you are creating your own package applications. By default, actually, let me just, I should be able to run that by default if I get this running. And I just comment that out. And you can see by default, we get the CX Oracle is the driver name with 80 dev. So again, if you're writing package applications, you can substitute your own names in here very easily. So this little Init Oracle client is just the few things which initialize another Oracle client layer for you at the application startup layer. You can call this once. If you call it multiple times, it will fail, give you an error that it's already been initialized. And what was I going to say about that?
If you don't call it?
No, if you, well, yeah, I was going to say, if you, at the point when you call it, it will actually load the libraries at that point of time. If you don't call this, then the libraries will get initialized later down when a connection is first used. So sometime perhaps later in your application, which may not be desirable to you, may or may not be desirable. Some people actually like that if they're shipping applications which connect to different databases and they might not even have CX Oracle installed, or there are client libraries installed. They don't want any initialization to occur. But sometimes it's useful to get that message back immediately. And there are all sorts of variations, like if you don't pass libdir, then the initialization happens at this call, but there's a standard default system library search path used, and some little interesting things there. So go away and look at the documentation. Please test that out. We're going to wrap up, as I say, pretty quickly for this release. Cursor prefetch rows. Okay, so prefetch rows is new in CX Oracle 8, or will be. You already have array size. Array size has been around for a long time. And these are tuning parameters. And at the risk of kind of explaining too much for you and not actually helping you, prefetching is used by the Oracle client libraries, and then array fetching is something used by the driver, by CX Oracle. And Oracle, as I say here on the slides, have the lower level has an execute phase where we send the SQL statement across to the database, and the database does some work and just sends back the sort of success failure message. And then later, CX Oracle will say, okay, give me some data. So it has the second fetch phase. So prefetching is a way that when this original statement goes across the database, gets executed, instead of just sending back the success message, we actually send data back, or Oracle sends data back. So it's prefetch data, even though the application has not yet, at this stage, requested any data. Array fetching then, the second time that CX Oracle wants more data, so I can see a hand raised, I can answer questions if they come up. Second time CX Oracle asks for more data, maybe you're doing a fetch, fetch many, or in some kind of loop, or you've got a huge data set and you're just fetching batches of records. The second and subsequent times that CX Oracle wants more data, the data just comes back, obviously via the client libraries, but it comes back into the array fetch buffers. So prefetch is only used for that initial execute phase, and after that, the array fetch buffers get used all the time. So I have these two buffers, and we tried for a long time to not expose all these two settings to you, but it turns out that being able to turn off prefetching is very useful in a couple of cases, particularly if you're playing around with ref cursors and passing them backwards and forwards, because sometimes you don't want prefetching. If you're not actually going to use the records in CX Oracle, you don't want them to be lost in these buffers. And so we decided in the end that after extensive kind of tuning, it's better for us to expose this as a separate setting to you and let you then customize for your data sizes. And I'll show that in the slides that I got coming up. Now, I saw a hand raised, but I don't have my screen up. So if anybody does want to yell out, Blaine or Anthony, just let me know for any questions.
Well, there is a question. We can answer it now, or we can wait till you're finished.
Well, let me go on, and then you can judge that as we go. So the final thing that I have to show is really just the prefetch code. I'm actually not going to run this because I don't have A, this table created, or B, this do something with rows set up. So trying to give you some kind of rough guidelines of when and when not to use this. So you can reduce those round trips to the database. Those calls across the database where the network has to be invoked, the Oracle network listener has to wake up, there are interrupts, the database has to context switch to something. You can reduce those round trips by setting prefetch rows. May depend on your data sizes. I spoke about that prefetch buffer, there's an extra memory copy which has to occur between that prefetch buffer and the CX Oracle driver. So sometimes for big rows, fast networks, that copy from that buffer may not be worth it. So you may find that the default of 2 is actually better in your case. But otherwise, sometimes for bigger sizes, and it seemed to be odd in my personal tests, I found that if I was fetching 50,000 rows, having a big prefetch rows helped. Sometimes fetching 1,000 rows, having prefetch rows at 2 was better. And then when I was fetching 10 rows, bumping prefetch again was bigger. And it just depended on my data sizes, how wide my columns were, how slow the network was. So it's a little bit of a tuning exercise that you have to go through. But this is, if you don't know anything better, just try this and then start tuning afterwards. And I do recommend you do that rough tuning. You know that if you're going to fetch 50,000 rows, you're not going to want it to default to 100 for array size. You're going to want a bigger value, 1,000, 5,000, something like that. It's going to use more memory, but that's your judgment call. But you do want to be doing that fine tuning in a production environment, because those round trip costs may actually turn out to be more expensive in a production environment when you've got a lot of traffic across the network and a lot more users on a production load. So what you find in your development testing is certain values work well, but then you go to production, you may want to do some fine tuning. And so you can look at reducing the round trips, number of round trips, and in the Oracle Python manual, there's a query, or will be, I think it pushed that query to show you the number of round trips, how to get that. Obviously, you can add your own timing to balance those things and check memory. So a couple of other cases. If you have a small fixed number of rows, this one's an interesting case. You would, in this case, set prefetch 1 greater than the array size. And the array size would be the exact number of rows that you're trying to fetch. And the reason you do this +1 is because that stops a round trip to check for end of fetch. So this query will only take 1 round trip to the database. That when the statement gets executed, gets sent across to the database, 20 rows of data will come back if there are 20, or whatever, up to 20 rows will come back, obviously. And that's 1 round trip.
There for a moment there, Chris.
Okay, yeah. So up to 20 rows will come back. This +1 stops an extra round trip for the end of fetch. And the last thing I have to say is, if you're doing single row fetches, you will want to just reduce array size. Prefetch count is 2, so that's already the +1. But this just reduces memory allocations across the stack. So this is useful to do. And yes, sometimes you may find memory allocators like allocating the same chunk sizes all the time. So go away and play with these things in your applications. But these are the starting points I would suggest. Obviously, 1,000 is totally dependent on how big your data is. But try these sort of 3 cases for your code and let us know how you go. And that is it. So we had
2 questions.
Yep, and I'll put the resources up for the attendees if they want, and just anybody who does want to drop off, we will have the video up after the session on the office hours page.
Yeah, so the first question is it possible to execute a SQL file using CX Oracle? And the answer to that, no, not yet.
No. Well, the answer is yes, but you have to write the code which extracts each statement from the file and executes them one at a time. The execute command that I just talked about, the fact we've got this sort of execute fetch model, that lower level API just takes 1 statement at a time. Even in SQL+, it just takes 1 statement at a time. We have talked a little bit about how to make this work. SQL+ parser is particularly old, going back decades, very lots of decades. And so it's got little quirks about white space and indentation and comments and things like that. If you look in the CX Oracle samples setup, Anthony actually has a routine there, a Python routine, which will read a SQL file with a limited syntax and execute statements sequentially. That won't cope with SQL+ commands like set commands. It has to have a slash instead of semicolons at the end of the statements and things like that, but that's one possible way. Okay, so I can see a couple of questions. Yeah. I can also see someone asking to talk. We'll just do the printed questions first. And Anthony, do you want to answer the next question, which is it advisable to bulk fetch rows into Python objects like lists or dictionaries?
Yes. Well, first of all, if you fetch, you get back a list. Like if you do call fetch all, you're getting back a list of rows. You can also iterate over the cursor, and that has one advantage, and that is that you're not using all the memory to build the big list. So if you only need to process rows one at a time, then use an iterator for sure. If you need to process all the rows at once, then by all means, fetch it into a list. A dictionary is more overhead. So if you need it, well, by all means do it, but it's not advisable generally.
So going back to the array fetching controls and prefetching I talked about a little bit, CX Oracle is always doing those bulk fetches for you underneath the covers. In the application, you may only be doing a fetch one and getting one row at a time, and that's just going down into the CX Oracle layer and getting a row of data. It's not going across to the database. So getting the benefits of the bulk fetches regardless of what you do in the application layer. Obviously, then there might be some of the things that Anthony just talked about as well. Okay. I know. So I see that somebody had a louder talk. That was just because my cursor was over the name on the screen. So I think that was it for questions.
Yeah, I think that's it. Unless other people have more, by all means, ask them.
Yell out now. We'll probably have our next office hours in a couple of months. We're going to try and run them every 2 months. And we'll take suggestions for what you want to talk about. That would be good to hear, since there's a lot of scope. Always a lot of new people, so we can revisit something or we can do something new. And while you're all typing, I'll just say that we recently ran our tutorial session, so that if you look at the GitHub homepage, there's links to the tutorial for CX Oracle. And we recently ran that as part of Collaborate, which I guess has now become sort of the Quest digital event. And Blaine and Anthony, and then one of my other colleagues, Troy, had converted all of that into cloud. So it was running onto Oracle Cloud, which was quite a really handy thing. And the link to that will actually go up on the GitHub pages when CX Oracle goes out as well, just because of the way the code push works into the GitHub pages branch. Or you can Google that if you really want to go and play with that CX Oracle lab in Oracle Cloud. So there's a Terraform instance which will create the database for you. A little bit of setup, not quite one single button, but then you can run away and play with that lab. Or you can do it traditionally as is currently uploaded and install CX Oracle and the database yourself. Just run through install a schema, take the SQL files we have, install the schema, and then run through the lab if you want to do that, if you're new or you've got new people in your team. So that's about it. Shortish session as always, just keeping you wanting more. I think we'll call it a day, and thank everybody for attending, and talk to you next time. So long from the team. Thanks, everyone.